And I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, David Fieni. He received his PhD in comparative literature from UCLA and his BA in comparative literature from UC Berkeley. He was the recipient of the Andrew Mellon Fellowship in French and History across the disciplines at Cornell University, and he's currently an assistant professor of French at SUNY College Oneonta. His research interests include Francophone and Arabophone literatures and societies of the Maghreb, cultural encounters between France and the Arab world, secularism and political theologies, the aesthetics of empire, and the ways that digital immaterial writing and situated material writing interact with one another. His recent and forthcoming publications include Maghrebi Afrofuturism and Anamorphic Time, which is in a collection called Justice in Time, Critical Afrofuturism and the Struggle for Black Freedom. Another piece called Tagging the Spectral Mobility of the Stateless Body in the Journal of Cultural Research. Street Art and Graffiti in Paris in the Routledge Handbook to Graffiti and Street Art. Algerian Women and the Invention of Literary Mourning in Dalhousie French Studies. What a Wall Wants, or How Graffiti Thinks. Nomad Grammatology and the French Banlieue in Diacritics. And finally, French Decadence, Arabic Awakenings in Boundaries. David Fieni also co-directed a special issue of Expression magazine on Moroccan writer Abdel Kabir Fatsibi in 2013, and an issue of the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing on the global checkpoint, Rites of Passage, Performances of Sovereignty. Empire of Language, his translation of Laurent Dubreuil's 2008 book, was published by Cornell University Press in 2013. David Fieni's monograph, Decadent Orientalisms, Configuring the Decay of Colonial Modernity in French and Arabic, is imminently forthcoming from Fordham University Press. The book offers a sustained critique of the ways that Orientalism and decadence have together formed a major discursive mode of the imperial imagination. It bridges several major gaps in scholarship, primarily the Arab and Islamic responses to Orientalism, and it does so comparatively in a manner that attends to historical modalities of thought and literary configurations of language, race, and religion and power. The book argues that Orientalism relies upon decadence as the figure through which its positivist scientific claims become redistributed as speech acts. Decadent Orientalism spans the 19th and 20th centuries, reads Francophone and Arabic texts in a comparative manner, and examines literature from both the Arab East, or the Mashriq, and the Maghreb, or the Arab West. His paper today is titled Dreyfus in Algeria, Disintegrating the Semitic Sub-Object. Please join me in a warm welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so is this working? Yeah. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you, Huda, for inviting me, and thanks to the Department of Comparative Literature. I'm very glad that you gave such a thorough description of the book, so that saves me time as well. This work that I'm presenting today was one of the first things I knew I had to write to make my argument work, and one of the last things I was able to figure out how to write. It's a kind of a hinge on which the argument swings. And my book is divided into two parts. And the first part is this title, the subtitle here, Disintegrating the Semitic Object, which explores questions that are emerging from philology, philosophy of history, civilizational discourses rooted in the 19th century and focused primarily on interactions between France and the Mashriq, or the Arab East. And the second part of the book focuses more on 20th century Maghrebi writers and thinkers, and they're working through post-colonial decadence in order to think about productive ways of getting past this dead end of Orientalist decadence. So this talk that I'll be giving today examines the Dreyfus affair and its juridical, philological, and literary afterlives in Algeria. And my goal is to identify the political, rhetorical, and social mechanisms that fracture the Semitic object of knowledge fabricated by European Orientalism. I will be speaking here of decadence in a formal sense as a breakdown, a disintegration of formally integrated elements. Just as Arabic and Hebrew, along with Arab and Jew, had been thrown together in the creation of the notion of the Semitic and the figure of the Semite, so too will they be cleaved apart by European Christian hands, drafting laws, running for office, and writing anti-Jewish pamphlets. This chapter of the book elaborates the effective stylistics of the disintegrating Semitic object, demonstrating how specific textual strategies of the burlesque, the carnivalesque, such as grafting, plagiarism, ventriloquism, perform a frenzied identification with the figure of the Jewish Semite. This disintegration of the Semite into Jew and Arab is an underexplored consequence of Orientalism and demonstrates the circuits through which the experiments carried out in the colony come home to the metropole to produce an effective minoritization of the majority French population. I'll be coming back to this at the end of the talk, and I think this is a particularly perhaps productive part of what I'll be discussing today, this notion of sort of a minority effect that gets circled and cycled through the exportation and re-importation of a certain kind of colonial experience of minority. So even as the creation of the Semitic object by Orientalist philology was an act of suturing together vast swaths of history and wildly diverse social formations, this philology was also invested in typologies and distinctions within the homogenized categories it invented. Edward Said himself characterized the views of Ernest Renan on this important point in a way that might mislead the incautious reader. No modern Semite, Said wrote in Orientalism, however much he may have believed himself to be modern, could ever outdistance the organizing claims on him of his origins. The fact is, however, that Renan and other philologists rather confidently claimed that certain Semites appeared to have gained more distance from those claims than others, thus creating important differences within the category of the Semite. In 1847, when Renan was but 24 years old, he affirmed with certainty that Jews were superior to Arabs, claiming that an Israelite could become a modern man if he had ample exposure to the Indo-European races, whose languages, Renan tells us, reveal a genius for internal diversity and a capacity for self-renewal and regeneration. Said famously called Orientalism the strange, secret sharer of Western anti-Semitism, as a quote, affirming that the two resemble each other very closely. Indeed, the shared history of imperialist representation and appropriation of Jewish, Muslim, and Arab cultures was among the missed opportunities for critical engagement Said identified in Orientalism Reconsidered, 1985. Despite, or perhaps rather because of the cleaving of the Arab and Jew and the birth of anti-Semitism, modern anti-Semitism, the linked histories of Jews, Arabs, and Muslims, as well as the totalizing discourses created about them in Europe, can and should, I would argue, be discussed in relationship to Orientalism. In thinking critically about the ways of Semitization and de-Semitization of both Arabs and Jews, it becomes an ever more pressing task to detail in a historically attentive manner the disintegration of the concept of Semite that had been created to contain, manipulate, and control Jews, Arabs, and Muslims en bloc. My claim is that the Dreyfus affair, specifically as it played out in Algeria, represents a crucial moment when the Semitic object suffers an irreparable crack, and that the subsequent process of the disintegration of the Semitic is inextricably bound up with the accusations of the so-called decadence of the Oriental. In tracing the genealogy of the Semitic object back to its emergence in French in the 19th century, one in fact traces nothing less than the colonial engineering of enmity between Jews and Arabs, a kind of reverse engineering of an object designed to fail. It is striking the degree to which French colonial policy in the second half of the 19th century in Algeria matches up with Renan's claims about the capacity of Jews to assimilate to modern European society, however mediated by Indo-European culture it may have been. The series of legal decrees unequally distributing citizenship and rights to Muslims and Jews had already set the stage for what would transpire in France's most prized colony when the French Jewish naval captain Alfred Dreyfus was wrongly convicted of treason against the French state in 1894. The subsequent affair cleaved French society between the Catholic right and the secular left, creating lasting enmities in social, political, and intellectual life. But it was in Algeria, perhaps more than anywhere else, that the Jewish question had to confront the Semitic question. While Napoleon III's Second Empire used statecraft to sculpt the Semitic population of Algeria from above and abroad, granting rights as facilely as it stripped them away, local politicians in Algiers and Oran were quickly learning the political uses of vulgarized Semitism to gain political advantage among the minority French and European populations caught in the grips of anti-Dreyfus paranoia. Combined with the sequence of national decrees regarding citizenship and rights, as well as the rise of the anti-Jewish press, the Dreyfus affair in Algeria demonstrates how the legal and political apparatus of France allowed the metropole to fine-tune Orientalism by tapping into, amplifying, and strategically redirecting existing fears and local conflicts of peoples and Semitic. While conflict between Jews and Muslims had of course existed in Algeria well before the 19th century, the rise of specifically European anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism, what I am tempted to call colonial fin de siècle Orientalism, was felt by Algerian Jews of the period to be a radically new development, as I will allude to momentarily. For this reason, one should read accounts of homegrown anti-Jewish attitudes among Muslims in the Maghreb with a high degree of circumspection. Take, for example, historian Stephen Wilson's highly regarded Ideology and Experience, Anti-Semitism in France at the time of the Dreyfus affair, which remains among the most authoritative and comprehensive monographs on the affair in English. The author cites a passage from André Gide's journal from 1896 as proof of existing anti-Semitism in the Maghreb. Even a brief analysis of the passage cited by Wilson reveals that the example of Arab anti-Semitism that he thinks he has identified is in fact a recent import from a France being shaken by the Dreyfus affair. In the text, Gide mentions that he has just introduced Athman ben Salah, his young Tunisian servant, turned lover and poet, to the 1001 Nights, presumably through Antoine Galland's 1704 translation. Let's see here. Oh, there's my book cover. So before we get to this quote, you see that there's a painting by Jacques-Émile Blanche, which gives us all the main players of this drama, this André Gide et ses amis au Café Mort de l'Exposition Universelle, and this is from the year after the World's Fair, which actually helped shut down the Dreyfus affair because they wanted to sweep under the rug. So according to Hannah Arendt, they wanted to sweep under the rug so they could have a really great World's Fair. And so we have André Gide and we have Athman there in the middle with this, looking to the side, and we are in the Café Mort, which is filled with artifacts that André Gide had collected. So he brought his own simulacrum to the simulacrum and placed his lover in the middle of it. And so we have this a visual version of what I'm about to present in this quote. So Gide continues in this vein in terms of presenting sort of Arab culture to his young lover, pointing out how things that one might assume to be part of Athman's experience have all been mediated by Orientalists and Europeans. Athman has found some collection or other of lives of famous men, and now on the subject of camels, quotes Buffon and Cuvier, never talks of friendship without naming Henry IV and Sully, of courage without Bayard, and of the Big Dipper without Galileo. He writes to Degas, upon sending him a walking stick made of a palm stem, what I like about you is that you do not like the Jews, and that you read libre parole, and that, like me, you consider Poussin a great French painter. What this passage illustrates is how anti-Semitism becomes just another item in a list of subjects: friendship, courage, camels, constellations, which, like the 1001 Nights, have been introduced by Athman, already framed by Orientalist modalities of knowledge. In other words, this passage does not serve as proof of existing anti-Semitism among Maghrebi Muslims, as Wilson claims, but rather as evidence of its importation into the colony. Major riots broke out in Oran in 1897, and then in January 1898, in response to the publication of Zola's J'accuse, which he accuses the French government of a massive cover-up, which turned out to be the case. Riots and pogroms spread across the country. Wilson tallies the damage thus: 158 shops were destroyed, 6 Jews were assaulted, 2 fatally, and 9 rioters, 47 police, and a large but unknown number of Jews were seriously injured. Police records in Oran, where anti-Jewish rioting had first occurred in 1897, reveal that while some Spaniards and Muslims joined the French in these riots, both of these groups were recruited by the French anti-Semites, who paid them 50 francs to ransack the Jewish quarter and yell, "À bas les Juifs, mort aux Juifs." The detective work of one secret police agent from Algiers turned up the numbers of the specific franc notes that had been used to pay the rioters. So there's this kind of trail of forensic evidence of all of these places and locations and moments when this anti-Semitism was imported and brought into Algeria in this period. The anti-Jewish riots seemed to energize newspapers modeled on La Libre Parole, which is a newspaper that Othman is referring to, sort of maybe the leading anti-Semitic news journal of this period, founded by Edward Rouman, who also had a lot to do in Algeria as well. And you can see this is just one cover that is sort of playing off of this literary or visual vocabulary of this kind of orientalized Jew. And this is Degas, who was in fact a serious anti-Semite. And one of his paintings that sort of serves as a model to the cover of Libre Parole. The point I'm making is that of course there was this explosion of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish newspapers in France in this period, but then there were also this just an incredible number of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic newspapers coming out of Algeria as well. And the one I'm going to talk about is called La Lutte Anti-Juif, the anti-Jewish struggle, something like this, which had a run of 37 issues beginning on February 2nd, 1898. The paper printed a list of crimes for which Jews had been convicted, covered local politics and business news, reported on the Dreyfus affair, and ran items urging French and other European women alike to boycott Jewish-owned businesses. And you can see some of the ads here as well. Welcome to that. So one issue included a list of initials of those women who had not heeded the boycott and been spotted entering Jewish establishments. We have a kind of mass media public shaming going on here. Within this imported model of mass-mediated anti-Semitism, one finds strikingly literal examples of imported anti-Semitism announced in the advertisements. Ads for cigarettes anti-Juif and absinthe anti-Juif appear throughout the paper alongside pleas to boycott Jewish businesses. If the Semitic object was fabricated in the high-tech philological lab of scholars like Franz Bopp and Ernest Renan, it broke apart as a result of the most banal workings of commerce and money. There's a whole story about this absinthe that it's quite fascinating. This newspaper also imported the stylistics of the Dreyfus affair, publishing in 3 installments what it announced would be a full-length serial novel, or feuilleton, Les Mystères d'Alger, which changed its name to Les Mystères d'Algerie before its first installment, which tells the cloak and dagger tale of a secret meeting between an Algerian Jew described in a very orientalizing way and a shady government minister's underling. An advertisement announced the novel's unremarkable melodramatic style as somehow a creation of the political and economic crises of the day, all of which are dubbed quote-unquote Jewish mysteries. This is the part of the announcement, which I'm not going to read, but it's there for you. This mystery will, quote, find its place in this novel, unquote, a formulation that suggests that in a world where cover-ups are the rule in a media landscape of fake news, only fiction can manage to supposedly point in the direction of the hidden truth. Part of the melodramatic style consists of the Semitic typology of the descriptions, in which the Semitic traits of the characters are unmistakable according to this vocabulary, and so too the author's anti-Semitic perspective. We are led to believe that something like a grand conspiracy is being hatched in which the French government under Napoleon III is laying the groundwork for Jewish control of Algiers. Readers would have been reminded of the Senate Consuls of 1865, which was promulgated by Napoleon III the following year and opened up French citizenship to Jews and Muslims, though with severe limitations, so severe that only, I think, fewer than 3,000 Muslims would even apply for this over the course of the next century. Zola himself foregrounded the low melodramatic roman feuilleton style of the intrigue that constituted the Dreyfus affair in his famous letter J'accuse. According to Zola, the acts of one of the key players responsible for the government cover-up, Hattie Declam, were haunted by fictional intrigues, stooping to the devices of dime store novels, stolen documents, anonymous letters, meetings in deserted locations, mysterious women at night smuggling crushing proofs, end quote. Zola's observation points to how the Dreyfus affair went beyond social, political, or economic spheres as it conjured a full-fledged crisis of signs that radically transformed the acts of reading, writing, and interpretation of the French public. And while one could point to the effervescence of pamphlets and news outlets devoted to the affair in France, which would resonate for decades, and we can even see this in Céline's pamphlets, which I talk about in the longer chapter from the 1930s, is in Algeria where the drama of reading and interpretation becomes most acute. Several factors come into play in this crisis, starting with the creation of specialized news sources, published and marketed specifically either to Dreyfusard readers or anti-Dreyfusards, both of whom had come to mistrust print media for different reasons. Maurice Barrès articulated the anti-Dreyfusard mindset that claimed to be immune to facts, imagine that, and which would instead read all it needed to know in the race of Dreyfus himself. Quote, "I don't need anyone to tell me why Dreyfus betrayed," Barrès wrote in 1902, 3 full years after Dreyfus's pardon and release from prison. Psychologically, he goes on, "It suffices for me to know that he betrayed the intervals filled in that Dreyfus is capable of betraying, I conclude, from his race." Such a statement declares race as the only text with a stable system of signs and suggests that other media exist only to confirm the messages of race. Despite the somewhat better future for the Jews predicted by Renan and attempted with things like the Décret Crémieux, the Crémieux Decree, this then is one possible endgame of colonial philology, the cessation of careful reading and the foreclosure of all possible futures other than the one that philology claimed to have found in the past of so-called Semites, that is, dependence, arrested development, and decadence. The collapse of the perceived distinction between truth and fiction, indicated by Zola, pushed writers and readers in a variety of directions in search of a style. On one side, we see the emergence of a new market for the latest up-to-the-minute news, for more reporting. On the other side, there was an explosion of editorial forms and formats, as well as the birth of the intellectual. Sometimes people point to Zola's letter as being the birth of the modern intellectual. Caricature, burlesque, and other pseudo-comic styles rose up to counter the kind of doubling down of a Zola, who risked his freedom and reputation to broadcast what he understood as the truth. A rather extraordinary example of these two competing styles of sincerity versus burlesque can be seen by Comparative reading a short pamphlet defending Jews written by a Fieni, F-A-N-Y, and a somewhat longer anti-Jewish text written by an author who went by the name of Hugolin. Fieni's Le Juif Algérien was published on April 22nd, 1898 in Algiers, while Hugolin's text appeared in 1899, also in Algiers. It is significant that Fieni frames his defense of the Algerian Jew within the logic of Orientalism, progress and assimilation. Countering the allegation that the Jews are resistant to civilization, Fieni affirms that, quote, "One is obligated to concede that this march toward the realization of our dreams, of the mixing together of races, has been more rapid than amongst any other people," end quote. In his appeal to the principle of civilizational status, Fieni echoes Renan himself when he distinguishes the Jews as being well ahead of the Muslims in the race to escape decadence and decline. His analysis of what he calls the troubles for which our beautiful city has become the theater concludes that it is jealousy that is driving the anti-Jewish movement in Algeria, a movement that he says one could not even have predicted a few years prior. So this is just some of the evidence that suggests that there's been a radical uptick in anti-Jewish activism, sentiment, publications, etc. In his defense of the Jewish people, Fieni asserts that anti-Jewish sentiment arises from jealousy of the Jews' sobriety, their lack of backwardness, or retard, their fine powers of observation, and their ability to live within their means. The pamphlet ends with a reappropriation of the phrase that Fieni claimed has been wrongly usurped by the anti-Jewish groups, la France aux Français. So France belongs to the French. Whereas Fieni presents his case directly in a tone of measured sobriety, or sincerity, enumerating the positive qualities of the Jews and psychologically analyzing the anti-Jewish movement, Hugolin provides a burlesque of precisely this kind of Jewish voice in Algerian politics. If Orientalism, in Said's words, is a style of having power, and the close reading of an anti-Jewish pamphlet will give us the opportunity to read the style philologically, as opposed to doing a merely symptomatic reading of Orientalist philology and anti-Semitism. The text in question, signed only with the pseudonym Hugolin, contains both the thesis and the stylistic ventriloquism of the Jewish voice in its very title, burlesque petition addressed to the two chambers and to the ministers by the Jews of Algeria who claimed that a war of religion was being waged against them because they were being kept from assassination and theft. Essentially, the text mocks the claim that Jews are inherently assimilable, and it does so by appropriating the voice of the Jew making an appeal to the state at burlesque. The title is the only place where the text slips into the third person, where the carnivalized first-person plural agency of the petition reveals itself as the they of the Semitic object of Hugolin's rant. We are Jews, the text begins, and this title fills us with genuine pride, for Jewry is the finest essence of humanity, the highest aristocracy in the world. Is the opening line of this text. The author anticipates the same strategies that Céline will deploy in his anti-Semitic pamphlets of the 1930s. The text plagiarizes recently published anti-Jewish screeds and places philological corruption at the center of his rant, ultimately creating precisely the same kind of hysterical identification with the Jew that I discussed later in this fuller chapter in relationship to Céline. The burlesque petition thus operates by means of textual cannibalism, as if to illustrate a contemporary phrase that Fieni references in relation to the ravenous state of anti-Jewish politicians in Algiers. Généralement, on veut manger du juif. One wants to eat the Jew. One mode of this cannibalism is the recasting of the tradition of anti-Jewish polemics that cited the Talmud and Midrash to claim that Jews consider non-Jews less than human, and that Judaism requires Jews to kill non-Jews, among all kinds of allegations of that same sort. Instead of simply repeating these sorts of crude misreadings of rabbinic tradition, which have been a strategy of Christian attacks on Jews since the 12th century, Hugolin goes a step further. He places the outlandish rhetoric of these polemics in the mouth of a fictional Jewish spokesperson for the Jewish community, attempting an earnest or sincere self-defense of his co-religionists. And I quote from this burlesque: "We sometimes kill goyim, that is true. We steal from them every day, that is truer still. We mangle universal suffrage, and we endeavor to get corrupted men elected in order to become masters of politics. This is incontestable." The French word rendered above by mangle, tripatouiller, that's nous tripatouillons in the text, is a blend of two terms from informal spoken French: tripoter, to finger, to fiddle with, to masturbate in its pronominal form, and patouiller, to fumble with, to handle clumsily, to get bogged down in. The use of this portmanteau word renders in precise fashion the petition's own rhetorical and stylistic approach. It mangles both the previous anti-Semitic polemics that Hugolin plagiarizes and the rabbinic texts these polemics claim to be based on. Yet the text affirms that it is the Jews who mangle the principle of universal suffrage, that is, they misunderstand, misrepresent, mishandle their newly acquired right to vote and run for office, just as a poor actor would mangle, tripatouiller, the words of Racine or Molière. The mocking inclusion of Semitic words throughout the text reveals the symptomatic force of language in the colonial anti-Semitic imagination. To describe the flesh of Jewish women who are, quote, disposed to prostitute themselves, unquote, the text cites the opinion of what it calls our prosecutors, meaning, of course, the anti-Jewish politicians responsible for the text we are reading, and interjects the term jifat in italics, Algerian Arabic for carrion. Goyim, Sukkot, Pesach are some of the Hebrew words that receive similar treatment where italics and context mark these as both alien and pejorative, with the aim of creating a strong sense of the impurity of the Algerian Jews' French. Let us dwell just a moment longer on the lone Arabic word included in the pamphlet, jifat. The word's triliteral root boasts a semantic range including shun, repel, loathe, cast forth, foam, scum, or refuse, and a nominal form, jifat, which has come to mean carrion in Algeria at that time, but also bastard. Several 19th century French sources attest to the word's use as a way that Muslims referred to non-Muslims, including Jews, specifically in the locution, jifat bin jifat, or carrion, son of carrion. The use of this term in the context described earlier, a burlesque ridiculing the very act of colonized Jews appealing to the state that had thrust naturalization upon them 30 years prior, allows the anonymous author of the text to engraft the abstract moral lesson of Semitic philology, namely that both the Semitic and the Semite are not merely decadent, but indeed are already dead, precluding any further development, onto the transliterated words themselves. Like certain Arabic or Hispano-Arabic loan words that have become semi-naturalized in French, Fatma, Muker, and many others. For example, these terms of Semitic origins are made to function as tumorous symptoms of corruption and disease, pushing up against what would be the otherwise healthy skin of the French text. Insisted in the language, as Laurent Dubois has written in the context of Céline's Mort à crédit. The derisive inclusion of Arabic and Hebrew words can be called anti-Semitic in the properly philological sense of the term in 1899. That is, they both isolate and generalize the Semitic and also set the different kinds of Semites against one another. And here's the conclusion. In detailing the ways that European anti-Jewish anti-Semitism was imported into the colony and embedded within Muslim society, I am in no way trying to diminish or excuse racism coming from Arabs or Muslims directed at Jews, or that coming from Jews aimed at Arabs or Muslims. Instead, I hope to bring into focus a turning point in the shifting configurations of Orientalist modes of power, functioning on intersecting planes, juridical, political, commercial, representational, that still animate what Gil Hofberg rightly affirms as, quote, one of the best kept secrets, namely the overlapping between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. On the juridical plane, we see the Decret Cremieux emerge as something like a singular solution to the problems of colonial nationalism, the minority question, and Cremieux's own grappling with the Jewish question in these contexts. The ad hoc nature of the different legal statuses of French, Europeans, Jews, and Muslims in Algeria gives rise to strange alliances, paranoia, and an elevated sensitivity to accusations of treason. Charges of separatism by the metropole made the French colons eager to find scapegoats that would take the focus away from them. Politically, the Jewish question in Algeria had to confront the Semitic question. Whereas French Jews seeking acceptance and rights had long appealed to the spirit of Republican universalism, in the colony, leading Jewish figures sought this same end by appealing to the French pieds noirs as fellow minorities. Simon Canouy, the main Jewish political player in Oran at the end of the 19th century, testified in 1900 before a government commission that the Jews had no choice but to vote for moderate candidates supported by the administration, knowing that in Algeria, more than any place else, Jews could simply not live peacefully, quote, without the principle of authority and without the support of the government, given the 4 million Arabs surrounding them. End of quote. It is the merging of commerce and representation, however, where we most clearly see the disintegration of the Semitic object, which sends its shards into the 20th century and beyond. The mass mediatization of Jews, Arabs, and Muslims as plastic, manipulable figures of Orientalist desire and antipathy gains momentum during the Dreyfus affair, transforming race into a marketable, fungible fetish. The racialization of not only Arabness, as witnessed in the rise of Arab nationalism, but also of Jewishness, are both crucial consequences of the political minefield of the affair. So it should be no secret to even the most casual observer of colonial history that European colonialism entailed the exportation of racist ideology on a planetary scale. Yet the Dreyfus in Algeria demonstrates the fluid volatility of racial fictions and the collateral damage of colonized peoples who are not only subjected to these fictions, but coerced to assimilate, internalize, and perform them, both as a question of survival and as a precondition for the price to be paid for their entry into colonial modernity. These racial fictions are then shipped back to the metropole, where the paranoid fantasies of a specifically anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic conspiracy will circulate, mutate, and intensify, only to be broadcast back to the Arab world, such as what would occur during the rise of Nazism, when thousands of hours of anti-Semitic propaganda in Arabic were quite literally broadcast throughout North Africa by the Nazis, and millions of printed leaflets were distributed there. It is safe to say that ever since at least 1948, each rise in anti-Semitism has been accompanied by a rise in Orientalist racism, what we now almost comfortably call Islamophobia. The fate of the so-called Semitic object rides on the critical challenge facing us, that is, aligning Western anti-Semitism and Islamophobic racism under the banner of Orientalism and anti-Orientalist critique. Thank you.
Thank you for that fantastic talk. I think we'll open up the floor for questions. Yes.
Hi. Hi there. I enjoyed the talk very much. And I just, this is a question out of some ignorance, not out of, per se. I'm just wondering about the slippage between religion or religious affiliation, you should rather say, and race. right, in your talk, which I was seeing but not understanding, in the sense that I come out of a context in South Africa where the Jews were encouraged to come in because there was lots of anti-Semitism, but it was a place of refuge because the South African and the government and the British government before that were trying to up whites, right? So I'm just wondering about that disjunction, or is there any disjunction in your talk between race and religious affiliation or identification? Because in some colonial histories, they have to be completely bifurcated in order to understand what's going on. And so I'm not understanding that piece. And my second question is just a historical question about any differentiation between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Judaism.
Well, in Algeria, we're dealing with a population that has been there for
A long time.
hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to just point out is something new. And that is, I think, is new and is not always recognized as such. And of course, my point of departure for this talk is precisely, the actual, both the existence of anti-Jewish anti-Semitism in parts of the Arab world, and also the instrumentalization and exaggeration of sometimes of that same fact, you see. So I'm kind of taking off from that point of departure and also bringing with me or thinking about some of Gil Hultberg's work, and she has a wonderful article called Remembering Semitism that I'm drawing from and working through and trying to figure out. And so, so these are just bigger issues and my own way I situate my work. The question of Muslim versus Arab is really large, complicated question. To say nothing of the fact that many of these people that are being Semitized as Arabs would, of course, not have Semitized themselves as Arabs, Orientalized themselves as Arabs, but would have identified as according to different, their own so-called Berber tribes. And so there's all kinds of fictions being circulated here, and so and that's what that Berber question is kind of is in the back of all of this.
I guess just to say very pointedly, I'm trying to figure out what the theory is in your talk of the relationship between race, religious affiliation, ethnic identity, and colonial nationalism.
Well, to be honest, in this section I don't articulate anything of this sort. But in other parts I do talk about what I call in terms of kind of beginning from the philological racism, which is a very strange kind of racism that's constructivist racism, there's such a thing. So it's what I call the political theology of the color line. And so, I mean, just to kind of...
Yeah, coming out of South Africa, I understand what a political theology of color is.
Of the color line.
Oh, color line. Oh,
so the ways that religious identification intersects with racialization in all kinds of fluid and ways like that. So that's the theory.
Yeah, no, that's
or
fine.
something
I
like
just
that.
didn't see that in it. So thank you. That other people have.
Other questions?
Yes.
I wanted to pick up on actually one of your concluding sentences and thinking about, you phrased it as sort of rise of anti-Semitism accompanied by Orientalist racism that we commonly know as Islamophobia. I'm paraphrasing it a little exactly, so feel free to correct me. And I was curious about the extent to which those two things necessarily flow in that order. I take your point about the observation, and I'm sort of wondering about the extent to which the flow can function in both directions or not.
Sure.
And if I've understood, and again, it's a very local argument, but in terms of period and place. If I've understood your argument correctly, it would seem that that it can go backwards and forwards, but that once it's gone in one direction, it can't go the other direction, if that makes sense. Anyway, I'd like to hear some more.
Well, I mean, I think that to really think about that question and answer it, you have to continue looking at through all the different, what I say, it's not just me, but the Semitization, de-Semitization. And so Gil Anoujar talks about the de-Semitization of Jews after World War II, and the re-Semitization of Arabs. And the different, the kind of, I'm not going to answer your question very well.
It's not a very precise one, it's an invitation, really.
Right. and so I think that, and so I've included several other covers from some of these RNA press releases, and so you can see here that these are, this is in lieu of answering your question perhaps, but we have these clearly Arab figures stealing the blé, the dough, or the money, the wheat, and they're stealing it from themselves to help build the proposed Paris mosque. And so you see on the same cover one week there would be a photo. And I think really what it is, it's contingent, that it's just opportunistic. I don't think there's any kind of actual real logic to any of this. I think it is really what, like I said, it's a commercial base that sort of generates all kinds of racial fictions to sort of facilitate whatever flows. Those in power, those in the press wanted to facilitate. So just these are worth looking at and kind of talk about them. But you can see the Premier Decree. Can't quite read it, but it's in pidgin French. The quote down there, and then we have the Crise de la Bastille Juive. So we see this is an old trope of the revolution, and so that particularly that appeal to universalist revolutionary ideals by Jewish French people.
Karen?
I was wondering if there are other voices in this conversation of various press releases and productions and so forth, and that you've been discussing one that caricatures the Jews and impersonates the Jews in an attempt to show how ridiculous it is or how inappropriate it is for them to make any of those claims. You've also shown another one which takes more of a pro-Jewish position. Is there another voice representing Arab or Muslim viewpoints in this conversation? They have pamphlets and leaflets, and do theirs divide the viewpoint, or is there what you would find to be sort of a unified viewpoint? What do they say?
I found very, very little. I found some texts in Arabic that seemed to be French government-sponsored texts that don't seem to have a great deal of value in terms of viewpoint politics or something like that, representational politics. And so this is in the context of this chapter, I feel like this is a great silence in the discussion. And this is a debate, where you find the Muslim or Arab or Berber actors, they're in police records. You don't hear them speaking. You don't see them publishing. And perhaps I just didn't dig deeply enough, but I got pretty deep looking for material. This is sort of some of my most archival kind of work. And so I think that, and it's probably extraordinarily insufficient answer, is that, one way we could frame your question or answer that question is that is precisely an absent, a void in this conversation.
And what do you make of that void?
No, that's a good question. What do I make of the void? I think that, again, it would require, I feel like to really answer that question, it would require some further excavation. But I feel certainly level of sort of just, not having a voice in this debate, whatever we would make of that debate. Perhaps, I don't feel like that's much of an answer, but that's all I have for you right now.
us a little bit more about your archive and also maybe give us a few examples of racist philology.
Oh, I got plenty. So my archive, actually, I ran into Hook on this exact research a couple of years ago in the BNF, and they have a convention. They have this just incredible archive of anti-Jewish newspapers, and then I was able to find this large collection of anti-Jewish newspapers that were published specifically in these two cities. And so that some of it's digitalized, some of it isn't digitalized. There's one monograph that I was able to find on this, and there may be more, hopefully, that I missed. But there's one, basically a published dissertation that deals specifically with the anti-Jewish crisis in Iran in relationship to the Dreyfus affair. And so that's the archive. Can you remind me of your second part of the question?
Philology.
Philology. Oh boy. Well, I've done a lot of work on Ernest Renan, and he's you study him and you have a clinic on philological racism. I mean, there's a few things to say fairly quickly, and one is that philology was the new science of the day, and that the point was that we weren't just simply saying just anything. We were basing our conclusions on science. We were doing deep philological research into morphology, into language families, and the conclusions that Renan draws, for example, are the same that any racist would draw, but he does it through a constructivist methodology, meaning he's saying, I'm not just saying these racist things. He's not using the word racist, of course, but he's thoroughly racist in every everything he's written, pretty much. So he finds that the language gives proof. Arabic or Syriac or all the Semitic languages, they contain actual proof that these people whose languages these are incapable of development, of full expression in the way that Indo-European languages would be or were considered to have been. And so it's a kind of weird graphing of philology, morphology, syntactical studies onto basically the same base that that racism, that sort of the other forms of scientific racism that we see in the same period we're ending up at. So I think the thing that's interesting about philological racism is that its justification, its methodology, was kind of perhaps provided extra justification and I don't know, extra kind of a sense of objectivity, a sense of sort of, also a sense of sort of philology, that Ernest Renan was sort of the figure in the 19th century, one of the leading figures in France, intellectual figures, and someone who was a best-selling author, The Life of Jesus, many other works. And so I think that he is the model for this work. And it's in his thesis, it's in all of his work, it's everywhere. At the end he wrote an afterword, The Future of Science, which he first wrote in 1848, and he wrote one final note before it was published, republished soon before his death. He said, if I got anything wrong, it was that I didn't really have a clear enough understanding of the hierarchy of races. So that was his looking back moment. Yes.
I'm just having a question about the kind of boundaries or the survey of your project, right? So you mentioned about the de-Semitization of Jews after the Second World War. That's kind of not a global phenomenon. I mean, there are parts, so I'm just wondering about the boundaries, like there was a clear re-Semitization in certain parts of the world, especially that I know, in the global south. And then the second question that I have is around using the past for philological racism. Because we still have it now. I mean, we still have people walking around saying that, for example, the most obvious example I can think of is that the Xhosa and Zulu language, and in particular the San language, this is how you can tell that San are really backwards, right? Is because there's so many clicks in the language that it's clearly not efficient, which puts them right into the primitive arena. Like that's a, you know, so I would be just a little concerned about the kind of, what I see as sort of, you know, not that you're generalizing on purpose, but just when you take out a slice of your book, it's like I'm going, like desemitization, like where, and then, you know, definitely philological racism is alive and well and living.
Certainly.
Yeah.
No, so I think, I imagine that the case of South Africa would provide incredible correctives and ways of reframing even what I'm talking about here. I have no doubt of that. And I was less trying to sort of agree with Gil and Nijar talking about desemitization and re-Semitization, and more simply pointing out that these arguments have been made, and I do believe that these are convincing arguments in many cases. I mean, that's a whole other arena to get into, but like I said, I think I think that the existence of Jewish groups around the world will complicate all of these issues. The second question, philological racism. So I'm just simply referring to that, if you look at, philology is a research into the past, and the language would tell you something about the origin of the so-called Arab brain or something like that. And so that's what I mean. That's what I was referring to, and that's philology is an excavation of a kind of a past that would otherwise be inaccessible, and philology, in colonial philology, claims access to that past through philology. Now, so we have Semitism coined by a philologist, anti-Semitism coined by a journalist. I'm forgetting the exact dates, but it's exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about kind of an academic. Semitism, which is also anti-Semitism, Joseph Nassad points out, among other people. And so we, completely lost my train of thought.
The journalist coining anti-Semitism.
Right. So we have the difference between academic anti-Semitism and popular or vulgarized anti-Semitism. And so therefore we get into the stylistics of these newspapers, these pamphlets, which takes us into Céline as a kind of the colonial symptom fraying at both ends, in a certain sense. You see.
Thank you. Really enjoyed your talk, so I think it's just generated a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? John?
I had a question. Early on, you mentioned a couple of times concern about, or I don't know, it's a concern. There was this sort of rhetorical strategy talking about the subject suffering a crack or cleavage or something like that. And it seemed to me that rhetoric kind of moved against what I was hearing in the rest of the talk. And so I want to explain to you my misunderstanding, maybe you can clarify. So to me, what this talk did more than anything was to expose how precisely certain kinds of stereotype and prejudice is going on, is being constructed through these kinds of materials and debates at a particular moment, therefore constructing more stable subjects. So I wanted to go back to this question of what it means that we're talking about the fracture of the subject, when it seems to me that the discourse is constructing stable subjects precisely out of our fractured multiple identities.
Right, so I guess it depends who you are, if you're going to deem the subject becoming more stable in this context. I mean, on one hand, I guess there's a kind of a historical discourse that I'm trying to trace, and I'm trying to make something of that and intervene in that. And so we have the creation of the Semitic as a constructed object. We're throwing Jews, Arabs, other people together, we're throwing languages together. We're saying this is one thing. We're saying this is a unified thing. And then the next move I make is pointing out that even within that thing, Orientalism is East-West, homogenization, among many other things. Even within the East-West, even within the most dedicated Orientalists, we had distinctions being made between different kinds of Semitic subjects, or Semitic objects, if you want to use my term here. And so the first, it has to be sort of thrown together in order for it to be cleaved apart. So what I'm just simply, I had, in some ways, just background information on writing this. I had this question from the beginning of writing this project. When did this happen? When and how did this cleave apart? And doing research, reading, and talking to a lot of people about this, I kind of zeroed in on Algeria and the Dreyfus affair. And so, that argument is a historical argument that's not claiming to say everything about this issue. It's saying this is one moment when we see a fissure between this object, we see it cleaving apart. And the point, and I guess the other point is that I'm trying to articulate an argument, but at the end, trying to talk about a kind of critical task, and that is looking at Islamophobia and anti-Semitism under the rubric of Orientalism. And to do that, I feel like we have to do this kind of work and see when and how all of these different subjects and objects are manipulated, and by whom, and we see by whom and how, at least to some degree, hopefully in this talk, we get at least some sense of some of the machinations and modes. So it's like, to take this argument into maybe a more, we want to talk about psychoanalysis or talk about the psychoanalytic subject, this is another book, another issue. You talk about some of these issues in different ways in the same book, but not necessarily, not in this section of the book, which is kind of the most historically oriented, archival bit. That answers your question.
Okay.
I guess maybe this follows up a bit on your question, John, maybe not. I guess I see a lot of continuity in what you've been describing here as the anti-Jewish anti-Semitism with anti-Jewish anti-Semitism from the medieval period on Luncheon, around the 12th century. And I can see a lot of linear continuity in the attitudes and in the racial stereotyping and all of that. What I don't see in the meantime is exactly the construction of a broader sense of the Semite that this is undoing. In other words, especially if the Arab voice is silent in this conversation, what I think I'm hearing is mostly another version of traditional anti-Jewish anti-Semitism. Without that joined construct that you say is never fractured. I'm asking, was it ever really there in Algeria in this period, which is the time and place that we're looking at? Or is that itself imputed to that time and place by, say, other modern scholars who then say that, well, then you have to be fractured? Is it being reified rather than was it actual?
I think this is a very good question. One place where I try to articulate this, and I haven't cut out a lot, obviously, to get close to fitting into the time, is precisely in that distinction between Arabs and Jews that we find in philology itself, and the decrees in Algeria that granted rights to Jews but not to Arabs or Muslims. So we see that Semitic object sort of coming to life in the juridical plane, and there's a series of decrees. It's an entire puppet show of legal apparatuses and the consuls and all of these things. So that's one place. But I'm still, as you say, thinking about that Arab or Muslim voice that we, so in the first part of my book, I talk about the Nahda, 19th century Nahda, Arab Renaissance, which doesn't really hit the Maghreb for decades afterwards, and it hits it in a different way, in a more politicized way, in a more reformist way, with Al-Muntaqid, the critic, in the 1920s. And so there's a lapse between these two discourses. But in terms of the, I absolutely, I hear your question, and I'm thinking about it, and I will continue to think about it, and I don't have any quick answer for the absence of the Arab voice in this particular moment. Perhaps the archive is, is something that remains to be theorized and perhaps added to this.
Sorry, I know we're almost out of time, but just on the question of the Arab voice on this, and I'm not sure if this is useful for you at all, but I know that there's a recent MLA anthology on writings from the Nahda that I co-edited that came out like a couple of months ago, and there's a little piece in there on, it's a news piece responding to the Dreyfus affair in Arabic, and I believe it's from a Cairo newspaper, I'm not positive, it's definitely not from Algeria.
Right.
It might be Beirut based, but I think it's Cairo based, and it's just a little piece, and maybe this could be the beginning of a paper trail for you to track down some of the Arab discourse around this, or Arabic language discourse around this question. That's all I sort of know about it, but just to sort of maybe point you towards that.
There's some very interesting stuff happening in Cairo and the Mashriq in regards to Dreyfus, and mentioned in Elizabeth Wood's work on finance and the Arabic novel and the figure of the Jew, and so there's stuff happening on that side of the world, and I think that's a helpful suggestion.
And to my memory, it's more of like a sort of news item. It's not something that I would necessarily consider to be a sort of like rich intellectual discourse in itself, but maybe there's some sort of citational, paper trail.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm sorry, I know we're out of time, but I think it would just be very clarifying to this question from Dr. Eckert to see whether the propaganda that appears, the anti-Semitic propaganda that appears in Algeria in this period, and that clearly has a precedent in the European tradition of anti-Semitism, whether it does have a precedent in the Arab countries, because if it doesn't, then it clearly shows that it is a new way of constructing anti-Semitism, but constructing it in this area of the world, because, this is not my field, but I have never seen propaganda of that type in Arabic medieval sources. Are there Arab medieval sources that look like that? Is there a precedent for it in historical materials?
These are good questions. The quick answer is that there's no question that there are conflicts of all kinds. I'm not a scholar of the medieval world, but I'm aware of the existence of different, certain all kinds of problems, conflicts. And so what I'm trying to do is trying to think about this particular change. Of course, it can be a little difficult to identify and to theorize a change without having what is being changed. But, I felt like I had enough, and I feel like it's at least a start, because there's so little, and there's very little that I've been able to find that deals with this question, where we have the Jewish question, the Semitic question, coming face to face. And so, there's the sources that say this is brand new. There's the birth of this anti-Semitic press is a new thing, which isn't in any way to say that there's not hatred or bigotry or exclusion of all kinds coming from the French, coming from all sides even. But it's the thing that I was able to do was identify a turning point, I think. And I wanted to bring that out, at least to open up a discussion about this moment. So that's the best I could probably offer right now.
Thank you, and I do think you definitely opened up quite a generative conversation.